Hydraulic fluid sprayed across shattered instruments. Altitude numbers spun wildly backward. Dead at his controls, a veteran pilot left everyone doomed. Elite SEALs braced for impact, cursing bad luck. Suddenly, a 26-year-old woman wearing an oversized hoodie stepped out of row 12, locked eyes, and said, "Move over." Lieutenant Jack O'Connor hated flying. He didn't mind jumping out of planes, and he certainly didn't mind calling in airstrikes from them. But sitting in the pressurized belly of a C-40 Clipper, a militarized Boeing 737, while someone else controlled his fate, rubbed his cynical edge raw. He was a SEAL. He preferred his boots on the earth and his rifle in his hands. Up here, 30,000 feet above a hostile stretch of the Sahel, he was just cargo. The cabin smelled of stale coffee, heavily oiled weapons, and the sweat of nervous men. O'Connor's team occupied the first 4 rows. They were 6 hours into a deployment jump, tasked with pulling a compromised intelligence asset out of a dirt-poor militia stronghold. It was a smash and grab. Fast, violent, and highly dependent on the man currently sitting in the left seat of the cockpit. That man was Captain Richard Callahan. Callahan was a legend in the special operations community. He was a silver-haired rescue pilot who had flown Black Hawks through the RPG-choked streets of Mogadishu and dragged C-130s out of the Hindu Kush on one engine. When O'Connor saw Callahan's name on the flight manifest, he had exhaled a rare breath of relief. If everything went to hell on the ground, Callahan was the kind of pilot who would land a commercial-sized jet on a gravel road to get them out. The rest of the plane was a mix of Space A travelers, military personnel catching a free ride to the next forward operating base. A couple of combat medics slept in row 8. A logistics officer was typing furiously on a laptop in row 10. And in row 12, hunched against the window, a young woman in a faded denim jacket and an oversized gray hoodie had been asleep since takeoff, her face half hidden by bulky noise-canceling headphones. O'Connor hadn't paid her any mind. She looked like a contractor's kid, or an admin clerk transferring duty stations. O'Connor checked his watch. 20 minutes until they crossed into contested airspace. "Hey, boss," Petty Officer Sam Wyatt murmured from the seat across the aisle, pausing his relentless disassembly of his sidearm. "You feel that?" O'Connor frowned. The deck beneath his boots was vibrating. Not the steady, rhythmic hum of the twin turbofans, but a high-pitched, grinding shudder. "Turbulence," O'Connor said, though he didn't believe it. "Doesn't feel like air," Wyatt replied, slamming the slide of his pistol home. "Feels like the engines are swallowing rocks." Before O'Connor could reply, the sky outside the window flashed a blinding magnesium white. The explosion didn't sound like a movie. It wasn't a deep, resonant boom. It was a sharp, ear-splitting crack, like a dry redwood snapping in half, immediately followed by the terrifying shriek of tearing aluminum. The aircraft violently pitched to the right, throwing O'Connor hard against his restraints. The cabin lights died. Emergency red strobes flickered to life. Then came the depressurization. A wall of freezing, thin air punched through the cabin. Dust, loose paper, and unfastened gear were instantly sucked toward the front of the plane. The oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments, dancing on their plastic tethers like hanged men. Missile, O'Connor's brain registered instantly. Proximity fuse. Shoulder fired. They were flying too low. Callahan had dipped beneath the radar ceiling to avoid early warning systems, putting them right in the lethal envelope of a man-portable air defense system. "Masks on!" O'Connor roared, though the wind snatched the words from his mouth. He slammed the yellow cup over his face and unbuckled his harness. The plane was in a steep dive. Gravity was pulling sideways, pinning men to their seats. O'Connor grabbed the overhead bins, hauling himself forward, hand over hand, against the sheer physical force of the descent. He reached the heavy, reinforced cockpit door. It was dented outward, the locking mechanism shattered by the pressure wave. He kicked it open. The flight deck was a slaughterhouse. The starboard windshield was entirely gone, replaced by a howling vortex of -40-degree air. The instrument panels were a mess of shattered glass and sparking wires. In the left seat, Callahan was slumped over the yoke. A piece of shrapnel the size of a dinner plate had sheared through the fuselage and embedded itself in his chest. He was gone. The legend was dead. In the right seat, the co-pilot, a fresh-faced lieutenant named Ellis, was screaming. Blood poured from a jagged laceration across his forehead, blinding him. His hands were hovering uselessly over the center console, paralyzed by shock and the freezing wind. O'Connor grabbed Callahan by the shoulder, trying to pull him off the yoke. The dead weight of the veteran pilot was forcing the control column forward, driving the nose of the plane toward the desert floor. O'Connor strained, his boots slipping on the slick, blood-coated deck. He couldn't move him. The G-forces were too heavy. "Wyatt!" O'Connor bellowed over his shoulder. "Get up here!" Wyatt scrambled into the cockpit, his eyes widening at the carnage. "Pull him back!" O'Connor yelled, pointing at Callahan. The two heavily muscled SEALs grabbed the dead pilot's flight suit and heaved. The yoke snapped backward. The plane groaned, the nose pulling up so violently that O'Connor's knees buckled. They were level. For now. But the alarms were screaming, a cacophony of synthetic voices and blaring horns. Terrain! Terrain! Pull up! O'Connor grabbed Ellis by the collar. "Ellis, fly the damn plane!" The kid shook his head, swiping blindly at the blood in his eyes. "I can't. Hydraulics are gone. We're dead in the water. I can't see." O'Connor looked out the shattered window. The brown expanse of the desert was rising fast. They had maybe 4 minutes before they became a smoking crater. He was a master of close-quarters combat. He could clear a room in 3 seconds. He could hold his breath for 3 minutes. He could break a man's neck with his bare hands, but he couldn't fly a crippled 70-ton jet. O'Connor stepped back into the cabin. His men were looking at him, waiting for orders. Elite operators, masters of war, utterly helpless. "Brace for impact," O'Connor said, his voice flat. He wasn't going to lie to them. "Callahan is dead. We're going down." A heavy silence fell over the operators, cutting through the roar of the wind. They gripped their armrests. Some closed their eyes. Some looked at the floor. Then a metallic click echoed from the back of the cabin. O'Connor turned. The girl in row 12 had unbuckled her seatbelt. She slipped her headphones off her neck and tossed them onto the empty seat beside her. She stood up. She didn't look panicked. Her face was entirely devoid of color, but her jaw was set in a hard, rigid line. She pushed past the sleeping combat medics, stepping over a scattering of spilled MREs. "Sit down, kid," O'Connor barked, moving to block the aisle. "We're going in hard. You need to brace." She didn't stop. She walked straight up to him, a full head shorter than the SEAL commander. "Get out of the way, Commander," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a sharp, metallic authority that made O'Connor blink. It wasn't the voice of a terrified civilian. It was a command. "You don't understand," O'Connor said, grabbing her arm. "The pilots are out. The flight controls are shot. She looked down at his hand gripping her denim jacket. Then she looked up into his eyes. Her gaze was dead calm, cold. "I know," she said. "Now let go of my arm before I break your fingers, because I need them to fly this heavy piece of shit." O'Connor's grip loosened just enough for her to slip past. He stood frozen for a half second, stunned by the sheer audacity of the threat, before turning to follow her into the cockpit. She stepped onto the flight deck and didn't flinch at the blood, the freezing wind, or the mutilated body of Richard Callahan. She moved with a frightening economy of motion. "Get him out of the seat," she ordered, pointing at Callahan. She didn't look at O'Connor. Her eyes were already scanning the shattered instrument panels, absorbing the data from the few gauges that hadn't spiderwebbed. Wyatt hesitated. O'Connor nodded. Together, they unbuckled the dead legend and dragged him out of the left seat, laying him respectfully on the deck behind the jump seat. The young woman didn't wait for them to finish. She slid into the captain's chair, ignoring the blood soaking into the cushion. She reached across her chest, securing the 5-point harness with swift, practiced clicks. She grabbed the yoke. The plane instantly bucked, fighting her. The right wing dipped violently. "Hydraulic pressure is 0, she muttered, her hands tight on the control column. She slammed her right boot into the rudder pedal, throwing her entire body weight into it. The muscles in her forearms corded tightly. "Ellis!" The blinded co-pilot jumped at the sound of her voice. Who is that?" "Shut up and listen to me," she snapped. "We've lost primary hydraulics. I need you to actuate the standby rudder and switch us to manual reversion. I can't reach the overhead panel without letting go of the yoke." "I can't see!" Ellis panicked, blood dripping off his chin. "You don't need to see. You know where the switches are. Overhead panel, top right. Flight control A and B switches. Move them to standby rudder. Do it now." Her voice was a whip crack. It cut straight through the boy's panic. Ellis reached up blindly. His trembling fingers found the ridged switches. He flicked them. "Done," he gasped. "Good boy. Now grab your yoke and help me pull. On 3. O'Connor stood in the doorway, bracing himself against the bulkhead. He watched her profile. The wind was whipping her messy hair across her face, but she didn't blink. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon through the shattered windshield. He noticed her hands for the first time. They weren't soft. The knuckles were scarred, and a patch of white puckered burn tissue crawled up her left wrist, disappearing beneath the sleeve of her jacket. 1, 2, 3, pull. She and Ellis hauled back on the yokes. Without hydraulic assistance, moving the flight controls of a 737 was like trying to steer a semi-truck through wet cement with the engine off. It required brutal, exhausting physical labor. The plane groaned. The metal airframe shrieked in protest. Slowly, agonizingly, the nose began to rise. The altimeter stabilized at 12,000 feet. They were still falling, but it was a controlled descent now. They weren't a dart heading for the ground. They were a glider. She let out a short, sharp breath, adjusting the trim wheel furiously with her right hand while keeping the yoke pinned with her left. "Who the hell are you?" O'Connor asked, the wind tearing his words, making him shout. She didn't look at him. "Captain Chloe Jenkins, 354th Fighter Squadron." O'Connor's mind raced. The 354th. Bulldogs. They flew A-10 Warthogs, close air support, ground pounders' best friends. She wasn't a civilian, she was a combat pilot. "You fly Warthogs," Wyatt said from behind O'Connor, his voice laced with sudden, desperate hope. "Usually," Jenkins replied, her tone dripping with dry cynicism. "Right now, I'm flying a very heavy, very aerodynamic brick." "Ellis, what's our engine status?" "Port engine is at 80%, Ellis stuttered. Starboard engine took shrapnel. It's surging. Fire warning light is flashing. Shut it down! Pull the fire handle, Jenkins ordered. If I shut it down, we lose our remaining thrust. We'll drop like a stone. If you don't shut it down, the wing is going to melt off and we'll spin into the dirt, Jenkins said coldly. Pull the damn handle, Ellis. Ellis reached up and pulled the T-handle. The starboard engine choked and died. The plane instantly yawed to the right, and Jenkins stomped on the left rudder pedal to compensate, her face pale with the physical effort. Okay, Jenkins said, her breathing heavy. We are single engine, no hydraulics, manual reversion. We have barely enough airspeed to keep from stalling. O'Connor looked at the navigation screen. It was cracked, but functioning. Nearest friendly airbase is Al-Assad, 400 miles north. We're not making 400 miles, Jenkins said flatly. We're bleeding altitude at 1,000 feet a minute. We have maybe 12 minutes of flight time left. Then where do we go? O'Connor asked. Jenkins finally turned her head, fixing O'Connor with a stare that made him feel like a junior enlisted man. Where were you boys heading? O'Connor blinked. Sector 4, a dirt strip near the border. But the mission is awash, Captain. We can't land this there. Give me the heading. You're not listening, O'Connor argued, his protective instincts flaring. It's an unpaved, rutted smuggler's road. It's built for Cessnas and turboprops. You try to put a 70-ton jet down on that in this condition, the landing gear will collapse and will cartwheel into a fireball. Jenkins turned back to the window. Commander, I've brought an A-10 back to base with half a wing missing and the hydraulic lines shot out by a ZSU-23. I fly things that are meant to be shot at. This is just a bus. She adjusted the throttle, her movements precise, lacking any wasted energy. Besides, she added, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm register, you have guys on the ground waiting for you, don't you? O'Connor didn't answer immediately. He thought of the CIA asset hiding in a mud hut, waiting for the extraction that was currently bleeding altitude in the sky. He thought of the promise they made to never leave a man behind. Yeah, O'Connor said quietly. We do. Then we have a schedule to keep, Jenkins said. Heading, Commander. Wyatt let out a low, breathless chuckle, gripping the door frame. Heading 240, Captain. Jenkins banked the crippled plane hard to the left, the airframe shuddering violently as she forced it into a turn it wasn't designed to make. 240, strap in, SEALs. It's going to be a rough ride. The descent was agonizing. Without hydraulics, every minor correction required brute force. Jenkins was wrestling the control column with the kind of grim, white-knuckled intensity O'Connor usually saw in men fighting hand-to-hand. Sweat beaded on her forehead, freezing instantly in the sub-zero air rushing through the shattered windshield. Altitude passing 4,000, Ellis called out, his voice shaking. He had managed to wipe enough blood from his eyes to read the remaining analog gauges. Airspeed 160 knots. We're losing lift. I know, Jenkins ground out through clenched teeth. She was constantly shifting her weight, using her legs and core to fight the heavy drag of the dead starboard engine. Keep an eye on the leading edge flaps. If they retract, we drop like a stone. O'Connor stood behind her, one hand braced on the bulkhead, the other white-knuckling the jump seat. The SEAL commander felt utterly useless. He watched the jagged brown landscape rising rapidly outside the window. They were dangerously low, skimming over rocky outcroppings and dry riverbeds. Visual on the LZ, Wyatt shouted from the cabin doorway, peering over O'Connor's shoulder. Jenkins squinted through the blasting wind. Ahead, nestled between two craggy ridgelines, lay a thin strip of pale, hard-packed dirt. It wasn't an airstrip. It was a glorified goat path. That's it? Jenkins asked, her voice tight. That's it, O'Connor confirmed. It's short, maybe 3,000 feet. A 737 needs 5,000 feet on a good day, Ellis choked out. With full flaps and thrust reversers. We have neither. We have gravity and friction, Jenkins replied, her tone terrifyingly even. Ellis, dump the fuel. Dump the fuel? Ellis repeated, turning his blood-streaked face toward her. Over land? If we hit that dirt with 40,000 pounds of Jet A in the wings, we won't just crash, we'll vaporize. Dump it. Ellis didn't argue. He blindly reached for the fuel jettison panel and hit the switches. Plumes of highly flammable vapor trailed from the wings, painting white streaks across the desert sky. Fuel dumping, Ellis confirmed. Good. Now, listen to me closely, Jenkins said, her voice dropping into a low, commanding cadence. When we touch down, we're going to bounce. Hard. The gear might snap. If it does, we belly slide. When we stop moving, you unbuckle and run. Do you understand me, Ellis? Yes, ma'am, he whispered. Commander, Jenkins said, not looking back. Get your men strapped in, tight. When this thing stops, you have exactly 60 seconds to get your package and get back on board before the locals show up to see what fell out of the sky. O'Connor frowned. Get back on board? Captain, if we land this thing, it's not flying again. Just be ready to move, she snapped. Go. O'Connor turned and hurried back into the cabin. The SEALs were already strapped into their crash seats, weapons secured, jaws clenched. They were men accustomed to violence, but this helplessness was a different kind of terror. Lock it down, O'Connor yelled over the roar of the single engine and the rushing wind. Heads down, brace for impact. He strapped himself into the nearest available seat, cinching the 5-point harness so tight it dug into his collarbones. He pressed his chin to his chest, interlaced his fingers behind his neck, and waited. In the cockpit, Jenkins was fighting the final approach. The dirt strip was rushing up at them, narrow and uneven. The crosswind was brutal, pushing the heavy aircraft toward the jagged rocks lining the right side of the path. Jenkins fought it, stomping the left rudder pedal with everything she had, her arms trembling as she forced the yoke against the wind. 50 feet, Ellis called out. Come on, you pig, Jenkins muttered, coaxing the crippled jet downward. Hold together. 30 feet, 20. The ground effect hit them, a cushion of air that usually smoothed a landing. But without flaps, it just pushed them back up. The plane floated, eating up precious runway. Put it down! O'Connor heard Ellis scream. Jenkins slammed the yoke forward. The main landing gear hit the dirt with a violence that rattled O'Connor's teeth. The sound was deafening, a monstrous crunch of compressed struts and groaning metal. The plane bounced, lifting back into the air for a terrifying second, before slamming down again. Brakes! Full brakes! Jenkins yelled. Ellis stood on the brake pedals. Jenkins did the same. But the wheels were skidding over loose dirt and gravel, struggling for traction. The heavy aircraft careened wildly, the nose wheel slamming into deep ruts, threatening to snap at any moment. Outside the window, a thick cloud of brown dust engulfed the plane. They were blind. The airframe shuddered violently, throwing the men against their restraints. The sound of rocks peppering the fuselage sounded like a heavy machine gun barrage. Hold it straight! Jenkins roared, fighting the yoke as the plane tried to veer into the rocks. They were running out of runway. The end of the dirt strip ended abruptly in a steep ravine. Come on, Jenkins hissed, her boots grinding into the pedals. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive momentum began to bleed off. The screech of the tires faded, replaced by the heavy, shuddering groan of the braking system crying in protest. The plane shuddered violently one last time, pitching forward as the nose gear sank into a deep rut, and finally, miraculously, came to a dead stop. For 3 seconds, there was absolute silence, save for the ticking of cooling metal and the hiss of escaping air. Then, Jenkins's voice cut through the dust-choked cabin. "Commander O'Connor," she called out, her tone dripping with exhausted sarcasm. "Your Uber has arrived. 5 stars, please." O'Connor unbuckled and scrambled out of his seat. The cabin was filled with choking dust. The SEALs were already moving, unclicking harnesses and grabbing their rifles with practiced efficiency. "Wyatt, secure the perimeter," O'Connor barked. "Miller, get the ramp down. We have 60 seconds before this place turns into a shooting gallery." O'Connor ran to the cockpit. Jenkins was slumped in the captain's chair, her head resting against the blood-stained headrest. She looked small, fragile, and utterly drained. Her hands were still gripping the yoke, her knuckles white. "You okay, Captain?" O'Connor asked, his voice softer than he intended. She opened one eye. "I'm alive. The plane is in one piece, mostly. Don't push your luck." "You did good," O'Connor said. "Stay put. We'll be back in 2 minutes." "Make it 1, she said, coughing. "That engine fire isn't out. The wing is hot." O'Connor grabbed his rifle and bolted for the aft door. The SEALs had already forced it open, deploying the emergency slide. They didn't slide down. They vaulted over the edge, hitting the dirt and rolling into firing positions. The heat of the desert hit O'Connor like a physical blow. The air smelled of aviation fuel, hot dust, and scorched earth. "Target building, 300 yards, dead ahead," Wyatt called out, pointing his rifle toward a cluster of dilapidated mud brick structures at the edge of the ravine. "Move," O'Connor ordered. The SEALs advanced, a well-oiled machine of violence and precision. They crossed the open ground in seconds, kicking up dust, their weapons scanning for targets. But the area was eerily quiet. The crash had terrified anyone nearby. They breached the largest structure. It was dark, smelling of goats and stale sweat. "Clear!" Miller yelled from the back room. "I have the package," Wyatt called out. O'Connor entered the room. Huddled in the corner, clutching a leather satchel to his chest, was a terrified man in a dirty suit. The CIA asset. "Let's go," O'Connor said, grabbing the man by the collar and hauling him to his feet. "We're leaving." They dragged the asset out of the building and sprinted back toward the crippled plane. But as they cleared the structures, the crack of an AK-47 echoed across the valley. Dirt kicked up near O'Connor's boots. "Contact right," Wyatt roared, returning fire instantly. A battered Toyota pickup with a heavy machine gun mounted in the bed came tearing over the ridgeline, followed by a half-dozen armed militiamen on foot. They had heard the crash and come looking for salvage. "Suppressing fire!" O'Connor yelled, shoving the asset behind a rocky outcropping. The SEALs opened up, their M4s barking in a deafening staccato rhythm. The militiamen were disorganized, but the heavy machine gun on the truck was laying down a terrifying barrage. Bullets sparked against the rocks, chipping stone and throwing dust into O'Connor's eyes. "We need to move," Miller shouted over the gunfire. "They're flanking us!" O'Connor looked back at the plane. It was 200 yards away, across open ground. Then, the whine of a jet turbine pierced the chaotic din of the firefight. O'Connor spun around. The port engine of the C-40 Clipper was spooling up. The massive turbofan was screaming, pulling in the hot desert air. "Jenkins, what the hell is she doing?" Wyatt yelled. The massive aircraft began to pivot clumsily in the dirt. Without hydraulics, steering the nose wheel was nearly impossible, but Jenkins was using differential thrust, slamming the remaining engine to full power, dragging the heavy jet in a slow, agonizing circle. The plane turned until its tail was facing the oncoming militia truck, and then Jenkins firewalled the throttle. The thrust from the port engine hit the dirt like a hurricane. A massive, impenetrable wall of dust, rocks, and debris was blasted backward at 300 miles an hour. The militia truck drove straight into the jet wash. The windshield shattered instantly under the barrage of flying rocks. The heavy machine gunner was thrown backward, screaming as he was sandblasted. The truck swerved wildly, blinded by the artificial sandstorm, and crashed head-on into a large boulder. The militiamen on foot scrambled for cover, dropping their weapons as the sheer force of the engine blast knocked them flat. "Go! Go! Go!" O'Connor roared, grabbing the asset and sprinting for the plane. The SEALs ran under the cover of the massive dust cloud. They reached the emergency slide and practically threw the CIA asset up the inflatable ramp. O'Connor scrambled up last, his lungs burning, his boots slipping on the slick yellow fabric. He tumbled into the cabin, landing hard on the deck. "We're in!" O'Connor yelled into his comms. In the cockpit, Jenkins immediately pulled the throttle back. The engine whined down, and the dust cloud began to settle. O'Connor ran to the flight deck. Jenkins was slouched back in her seat, her eyes closed, her chest heaving. Ellis was slumped next to her, looking like he was about to pass out. "Captain," O'Connor panted, leaning heavily against the bulkhead. "That was insane." Jenkins opened one eye, offering a weak, lopsided grin. "You said you needed cover, Commander. I gave you cover." O'Connor looked out the shattered window. The militia truck was a wrecked, smoking ruin. The remaining fighters were fleeing back over the ridge. He looked back at the young woman in the oversized hoodie. She was bleeding, exhausted, and probably concussed. But she was the most terrifyingly competent pilot he had ever met. "Captain Jenkins," O'Connor said slowly, extending a hand. "It's an honor to fly with you." Jenkins reached up and gripped his hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Likewise, Commander," she said, her voice raspy. "But next time, I'm taking a commercial flight. Your service is terrible." O'Connor laughed, a genuine relieved sound that echoed through the ruined cockpit. He turned back to his men in the cabin. They were battered, bruised, but alive. The asset was secured. The mission was a success. "Wyatt," O'Connor called out. "Yeah, boss? When we get back to base, find out what kind of beer the captain drinks." O'Connor smiled, looking back at the young woman who had just saved all their lives. "We're buying her a keg." If this story had you gripping the edge of your seat, smash that like button and share it with someone who loves high-stakes action. What did you think of Captain Jenkins's insane landing? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more intense, gritty military stories every week. We've got plenty more where this came from. Stay frosty, and I'll see you in the next one.